All right, Robby, what's on your radar today?
Well, with everyone in the mainstream media finally waking up to the reality that COVID-19 could have escaped from a lab, it's time to do some scorekeeping. Yesterday, I criticized a number of journalists who unfairly smeared lab leak defenders as racist conspiracy theorists. The New York Times lead coronavirus reporter, Apurva Mandavili, chief among them. Mandavili said the lab leak theory had racist roots. What she was actually doing is running cover for China's authoritarian government, who relied on useful idiots in the media to downplay the Chinese government's potential culpability on grounds that criticizing the Chinese government plays into Republican or Trumpian notions about the badness of China. But in fact, the U.S. Energy Department now believes, admittedly with low confidence, that a lab leak is the more likely explanation for COVID's origins. No matter how desperately the New York Times, CNN, the Washington Post, and other outlets had wanted to downplay this possibility. But it wasn't just journalists. Remember the Global Disinformation Index? That's the British nonprofit that smeared Reason magazine, where I work as an editor, as an unsafe news website using dubious criteria. Well, the Global Disinformation Index might want to take a closer look at newly uncovered disinformation being spread by the website of the Global Disinformation Index. Now, GDI is partly funded by the U.S. State Department and seeks to discourage advertisers from working with news outlets, like Reason, on the theory that we misinform our readers. It has recently come under considerable criticism from conservative and libertarian news websites following the publication of an expose in the Washington Examiner. GDI earned itself additional criticism this week after the U.S. Energy Department endorsed the lab leak theory of COVID-19's origins. Previous reports by GDI warned advertisers to blacklist news sites that attempted to blame the pandemic on a lab leak, and implied that any website asserting a cover-up on the part of the Chinese government was promoting racist disinformation with the capacity of harming Asian people. GDI's messaging on the lab leak theory was clear and consistent. News websites that explored this topic should be demonetized. According to reporting by the Washington Examiner's Gabe Kaminsky, I'm quoting from this article, GDI alleged in a February report dubbed Coronavirus: The Makings of a Disinformation Pandemic, the adversarial narratives are emerging as a key disinformation tactic. The report called out Senator Tom Cotton for raising the possibility on Fox News that COVID-19 came from a lab. Quote, by broadcasting the senator's words to a national audience, this debunked conspiracy theory is given authority, validation, and amplification, said GDI in the report. 1 month later, according to Kaminsky, in March 2020, GDI released a report titled Why is Ad Tech Funding These Ads on Coronavirus Conspiracy Sites? The report slammed Google and other companies for, quote, providing ad revenue streams to known disinformation sites peddling coronavirus conspiracies, called out the conservative blog American Thinker for publishing a commentary article titled The Wuhan Virus Escaped from a Chinese Lab. GDI also took aim at a company selling N95 masks for advertising in the article. That's all quoting there from Kaminsky's article, which I encourage you to check out. Now, portraying the lab leak notion as a dangerous racist conspiracy theory never made any sense, and journalists, health officials, and disinformation trackers like GDI that enforce this narrative should feel profoundly embarrassed. But that's not all GDI has to atone for. Now, one of the journalists I called out yesterday for saying the lab leak theory was racist conspiracy theory is Ann Applebaum of The Atlantic. Now, she penned an unfortunate tweet that likened Senator Tom Cotton to a Soviet propagandist for merely raising the possibility that COVID-19 escaped from a Chinese laboratory. Now, Applebaum has previously produced some excellent work. She has authored 2 books on the horrors of Soviet communism, Gulag, which is a history of Soviet prisons, and Red Famine, about the deliberate starvation of people in Ukraine. But she erred when she described the lab leak theory as akin to Russian disinformation. Notably, Applebaum was also listed on the GDI's website as one of its principal journalistic advisors. So given GDI's misguided approach to lab leak theory, I wondered if Applebaum was partly responsible. Had she advised them to do that? And whether she would now advise them to change course. So yesterday, I emailed her. Her response was surprising, to say the least. She says, quote, until a few days ago, I was not aware that I was listed as an advisor on the GDI website. I last spoke to them when they were still raising money, probably 2018 or 2019, have not advised them on anything or had any contact since. I have asked to have my name taken off their website, which they agreed to do. So GDI misrepresenting Applebaum as a member of its advisory panel is especially hypocritical, given the organization's stated reason for placing Reason, my magazine, on its list of 10 riskiest online news outlets. If you recall, GDI dinged Reason and other outlets for not displaying, quote, information regarding authorship attribution, pre-publication fact-checking, or post-publication corrections processes. So it's not exactly clear what the organization even meant by this. They did not respond to my request for comment. But their own website has clearly committed a transgression that sounds remarkably similar. It listed an advisor who actually had nothing to do with the organization on the website. And by the way, nowhere on GDI's website now does it currently explain the mistake. There's no statement along the lines of Applebaum was erroneously listed as an advisor and we regret the error. So it seems like GDI lacks clarity regarding its own authorship attribution and fact-checking processes. Time and time again, so-called disinformation watchdogs fail their own tests. This is a particularly galling example. The State Department has no business funding such sanctimony. And the hypocrisy is unending, by the way. MSNBC host Mehdi Hasan complained that conservatives were whining about whether COVID came from a lab or a wet market yesterday, implying that it really doesn't matter. So I responded, tweeting, do you honestly think the lab leak doesn't have any policy implications? The U.S. government funded the research on bats at the lab in Wuhan, and Anthony Fauci was the foremost public advocate of doing so. Hasan responded to me. He wrote, so here come the Fauci conspiracies. Didn't take long. I guess that's all it is. Can't talk about it. Fauci conspiracies.
I don't
Incredible,
know.
isn't it?
That particular logical fallacy always gets me. Twitter, when people say Twitter is bad and the discourse on Twitter is bad and it's not substantive debate on Twitter, it's because of responses like that don't engage with the substance of what you're trying to say there. Does it matter? Does it not? No. Here's why it does really, really matter. If I were trying to limit my liability because there was a global pandemic that resulted in millions of deaths, untold billions, trillions in economic losses, mass unemployment, all of that. And I could attribute it to someone who slaughtered an animal for food prep in the wrong way versus a multi-billion-dollar international organization with deep pockets who could actually pay. I would want to say, no. It was just the person who was, cooking animals wrong. Or cooking animals in an unsanitary way.
And you think that'd be obvious to a Mehdi Hasan type person who I know has progressive principles and other, is interrogating of business and government from a left perspective, and just goes blank on this.
But to be clear, again, it could be the wet market theory.
Sure.
It definitely could
Let's
be.
find out.
But to listen to, remember in the early days also, there was this little mini scandal, didn't become a big scandal because the media wasn't interested in this sort of thing. But one of the men who had been cited routinely for why it could not have been lab leak theory was linked to the funding of one of the major labs in Wuhan. So over and over again, from the beginning, it was suspicious because of those kinds of moments. It was very, very clear from a money man perspective that the interest of everybody involved was to make sure it was on somebody with limited liability, people who are unidentifiable. China very quickly kind of moved in and cleaned up the wet market, so there wasn't a lot that could be discovered there, and it was very easy to place the blame on an unaccountable party. Now, again, it could be that unaccountable wet lab mysterious origin. But how, as an investigative reporter, you don't have any curiosity about why, absent clear proof, the narrative was so strongly, unequivocally in one direction, and why so quickly it became sacrilege to even be open to the alternative in any kind of public setting. That should have set red flags off among the very people who are now coping, as you put it in an earlier segment, to make sense of the narrative that they've been regurgitating for the last 2 years.
And how about that? And I don't mean to harp on it, but this Global Disinformation Index tried to get my website and many others tried to target their funding, to have advertisers stop working with them. You'd think if you were going to get all hot and bothered about what the authorship and post-publication fact-checking process is, your website better be pretty squeaky clean. And they just made up that this journalist was involved in this thing in an ongoing fashion, and then they didn't acknowledge that they corrected it. It's just the whole disinformation industry is just.
Don't believe it because Trump said it. Don't believe it because Reason said it. Don't believe it because a leftist said it. That, and what Mehdi Hasan's doing there. Don't believe it because this is a criticism of Fauci. The kind of people who criticize Fauci. reality, that is exactly the problem with the discourse right now. It's why, we don't actually have different outlets covering the same kind of news, and it leads people to believe, like it forces people into their silos. I wish I could turn on Fox News and also see coverage of what's going on with the Dominion scandal. I wish I could turn on CNN and see coverage of lab leak theory, but that doesn't exist. And so what you believe becomes completely determined by the news channels you watch, unless you happen to find some bipartisan outlets like the ones we have here.
Well, that's why the best practice is for people to rapidly flip back and forth between the various channels so you can get a balanced news diet. That's what I do. I think more people should do that. Well, we will have more Rising right after this. Please stay with us.